creoles, which are probably languages which you have never heard of. So I hope in the end you will have some ideas about these 4 creole languages I'm going to talk about. So I have 2 very simple goals. In the first place, I just want to show that the 4 languages I'm going to speak about spread from a single proto-language. So there is one language that from the late 15th century on formed on the main island, the island of Santo Tomé, which then gave rise to 4 different languages. So a new language arose and it branched into 4 different languages. So that will be very clear throughout the talk, I think, from the linguistic data. But I also want to show, so I want to have a look at the impact of African languages on the formation of these creoles. So these creoles are of course Portuguese related, which means that most of the lexicon is from Portuguese, as we will see. But these languages are of course created by African populations, speakers of African languages. And there are with respect to the slave trade, there are 2 main areas, as we will see in a minute, which were very important for the population, the settlement of the Gulf of Guinea islands. And what I'm going to show is that actually there is one specific area of these 2 main areas which was particularly relevant to the formation of this proto-language and then the other languages, of course. So I'm going to draw from evidence from his history, linguistics, and genetics. And in the end, if you have questions, please ask. So, these are the 4 languages spoken on 3 different islands. So you really have to pay attention now because we will be going back to these names all the time. In the first place, the main island, the island of Santo Tomé, which has 2 creole languages, Santo Tomé and Angula. Santo Tomé is, they're all minority languages because Santo Tomé, in principle, is an independent republic where the main and the official language is Portuguese. Then in the southern portions of the island you have another creole which is Angula. On the island of Príncipe you have Lunguia, which means language of the island. It's Língua da Ilha in Portuguese, and then I'm sure if you speak Portuguese, but then it's a creole formation, of course. And then we have another island which does not, which belongs to Equatorial Guinea, Anambon, which has this language Fadambo, which is from Portuguese, Fala de Anambon, the speech of Anambon. So all these languages are, to some extent endangered. So which means that Fadambo has like 4,000 to 5,000 speakers, Angula 10,000, Santo Tomé, according to the census, 60,000, and the Creole of Príncipe, maybe a few hundred speakers or less. So this is probably the language which is going to die out first, although there are some efforts to revitalize this language in particular. It sound, I didn't test the sound, but I'm going to play a short sample of the main Creole language so you have an idea. So if you know Portuguese or any other Romance language, it will be particularly interesting to listen to this audio fragment. So, I'm not sure if you speak Portuguese, I hope you could hear it, but I can tell you that like 95% of the words are derived from Portuguese, but it of course sounds very different from Portuguese. Okay, first a little bit of history. So of course, when we talk about the formation of these languages, we have to talk about the settlement of these uninhabited islands. So the islands were settled in 1493 in the case of Saint-Omer, so it was a large-scale settlement. The island of Príncipe was then settled from the island of Saint-Omer around 1500, and the island of Annobon to the south, as we saw on the map, was also settled from Saint-Omer, but much later. Who were the settlers? Well, mostly Portuguese men, a large number of convicts, so it was kind of a colony for people who had committed small crimes in Portugal, clergy members, soldiers, according to the historical data, also quite a relevant number of Jewish orphans from Seville, which were, when they went to Saint-Omer, under 8 years old. And of course a large number of continental Africans, which were predominantly slaves. Because the settlement of the island of Saint-Omer was intended to produce sugar, and Portugal was already doing these experiments first on Madeira, on the island of Madeira, and then on Cape Verde. But Saint-Omer was really the best place to produce sugar, and was during the 16th century one of the world's most important sugar producer. Okay, before, of course, and then of course the sugar production went to Brazil and to the Caribbean areas. Okay, well, from the context, so this, I'm kind of cutting this a bit short, but from the contact between these different people, the Portuguese and the continental Africans, which were of course from different, well, they were speakers of different languages, a new language was born. So I'm not sure if you're familiar with the Pidgin Creole cycle, which means that actually the slaves created a new language, so they needed kind of a means of inter-ethnic communication between them, and based on the dominant language, which was Portuguese, so they started creating a lingua franca, which was not their native language. But of course, over time, after 1, 2, 3 generations, this language was being picked up by children, and as their first language. So they also picked up African languages, of course, but also this lingua franca, which was around in the new settlement. And well, this is, of course, you know, the process from a second language acquisition to nativization, and so a new Creole, a new language was born in this context. It's also very important to notice that there were two different periods of settlement on the island. So in the first place, well, we know this especially from the Caribbean experience, there's the so-called homestead society, the Société d'Habitation, and in the second place there is the so-called Société de Plantation, the plantation society. And this basically means that, well, that in the first period, during the homestead period, the island was being prepared for the economic cycle. So there was no economic cycle yet, there were no sugar mills. But this started happening a couple of years after the initial settlement, like 20-25 years later. And the interesting point about Saint-Omer is that the homestead society corresponds more or less to the slave trade from southern Nigeria, and the plantation society corresponds to the slave trade from another area, western, well, Angola, the Congo, and the languages which are spoken in these two areas are actually quite different. And so when we look at the Creole languages, we get an idea of what impact these different African continental areas made on the formation of the new language. So were both areas relevant? So slaves from the first period from southern Nigeria, and slaves from the plantation period from Bantu areas, so Congo, Angola, or is there a difference? Were the first slaves more important than the slaves that arrived later? Which is the case, as we will see. So it's very clear that during the first 20 years, more or less, the slave trade was almost exclusively from southern Nigeria. And there are lots of historians who have studied this based on the embarkation records of the slave ships, but even with eyewitnesses like Pacheco Pereira in 1506 already noted that, and he was really present in this area. He noted that almost all the slaves were from the rivers of the Niger Delta, so from southern Nigeria, and not from the Congo. He states this very explicitly. And this is interesting because now we can look at the creoles and see what features are from which of these areas. So here you see the evolution of the sugar mills on the island of São Tomé. So of course in the first 20-30 years there were no sugar mills, so the island was being prepared during the homestead society for the economic cycle. But then very quickly we had 2, 3, 6, 60, and especially in the second half of the 16th century there were over 100 sugar mills on the island. And then there was a very quick decay after the end of the 16th century because, well, it was because for several reasons. In the first place, because the sugar in Brazil was of better quality. But there were also many attacks on the plantation system from slaves who had fled away to the bushes, and there were several thousand slaves who had escaped from the plantation system, and they posed a real threat to the system. And of course, the French and the Dutch started to attack the islands because they were also interested in exploiting this sugar and the economic cycle. So after that, São Tomé, the main island, continued to be important, of course, in the transatlantic slave trade, also as well for water supplies and vegetable supplies, etc. So, but it lost its economic cycle. But it's very important to note, I'm going to say this because of the last part, the genetic part there, only until 1515, 1520, the slaves were from the southern Nigeria. After that, almost all the slaves over the centuries came from Bantu areas. So what we expect to see when we look at genetic data is that there is a large impact of Bantu with respect to the genotype of the people from the island of São Tomé. Okay, so keep this in mind and we will get there in a few minutes. Okay, so this is the idea. The first period, southern Nigeria. The second period, so the plantation period, Congo, Angola, Central Island, São Tomé, and from São Tomé, of course, we had a spread to the other islands, including a spread of the languages. So this was the question I was just mentioning. So to what extent did the languages spoken in these two slave trade areas affect the formation of the language that formed on São Tomé? So this new language, this pidgin that developed into a native language, the so-called Creole language. And we will see that it was actually that the southern Nigeria, the Niger Delta, was actually crucial to the formation of this new language, and not so much the Bantu area. Which means also something very important, which is that creolization on the island of São Tomé was very fast. Because there are several studies around who, well, some people say, okay, it was fast here and there, but there are also studies that show that, for example, in Suriname, creolization was quite slow. It's so-called gradualism hypothesis. Because there was no renovation, there were no children being born, and the children, of course, to nativize the language. Well, but on São Tomé, according to the evidence from the different from linguistics and genetics and history as well, we can really conclude that creolization took place very quickly. So we have the proto-language, and this is a very basic drawing, of course, and this language branched into 4 different languages. Of course, we can also imagine other scenarios. I will not discuss them because the continuation of the proto-language is of course this language, Santomé. So we can also imagine that perhaps Fadembo, which was the latest to branch off, branched off from this language and not really from the first point. So there's still some work to do with respect to the historical reconstruction of this young language family. So I'm calling it a language family because, of course, they're related to Portuguese, but they're very different, and it's quite natural to see these languages as a young language family. So I'm just going to make a few very short observations about genetic classification. So in the first place, when we talk about creoles, you probably know this, we have to say that the grammars of these languages are a compromise between grammars of different languages, in this case Portuguese, and different African languages, but also with an important role for innovation. But on the other side, the lexicon, as I mentioned, is mostly derived from Portuguese. So around 90% of the lexicon comes from one source, which is Portuguese. So this is the lexifier language or the superstrate language. And of course, I'm not sure if you're familiar with the comparative method, but the comparative method, which is around for a couple of centuries now, and is still doing well, I would say. From the perspective of this method, we have to really say that these creoles are in the genealogy of Portuguese. Okay? Because what we find are many cognates, so words that descend from a common root, and we find regular sound correspondences. So there is only, of course, often people discuss the issue of creoles having a very sudden birth, which is different from the regular transmission we see from Latin to vernacular Latin to the Romance languages. But the process is really not that different. And the comparative method is not really interested in, in history. It's interested in the linguistic data. And if we look at linguistic data, and I have a few examples here, we see that there are cognates and that there are regular correspondences. So, for example, in Portuguese you have chorar, Old Portuguese chorar, or chave, chuva, Old Portuguese chuva, or chuva, depending, of course, on the region of Portugal where this word is pronounced. And in, for example, Santomé, the main Creole language, we have sola, sabi, sula. So there is a depalatalization rule applying to all these items which have an initial palatal. The R, the rhotics, I'm not going to discuss all the types of rhotics, of course, but if you look at the rhotics, we see that in this Creole they have mostly changed to a lateral. So dinheiro, dinheiro, febre, febre, rir, li. Okay? So this is really regular. Diphthongs, Portuguese diphthongs, pai, peg, vai, beg, barriga, belly, through an intermediate step with deletion, which is very common actually, barriga, baiga, bega. So we really see that regular processes are applied to the Portuguese word. And there are many different processes, of course I cannot show them all, but for the comparative method, this is really sufficient to say that these languages are in the genealogy of Portuguese. And I was just saying to Anne that if you look at the side of Ethnologue, Creole languages are actually classified as a language family, which is of course wrong, because you find French Creoles, Portuguese Creoles, English-based Creoles, Spanish-based Creoles. They're all lumped together because, I don't know, because they think there is something special about these languages, but really the methods we use for other families like Indo-European or Niger-Congo or Sino-Tibetan are the same we can apply here, and the result is that these languages are in fact part of the, our new family which came about from Portuguese. Although although there are many different syntactic differences, as we will see in a minute. So what are the lexical layers in these creoles? First, Portuguese, as I mentioned. So really, if we look at the lexicon, we see that most items are shared by these languages, like perhaps 70%. But then there's also an important layer of Nigerian lexicon. So lexicon from Nigerian languages, and especially from one language, Edo. And if we look at the 4 creoles and we see that a lexical item is shared by all the 4 creoles, we kind of have to conclude that they descend from a common root. Okay? So this happens with Portuguese and with many words from Nigerian languages. The Bantu lexicon, so the area which was relevant during the plantation society, the Congo, Angola, you also contributed quite a lot of lexical items, but these items are not typically shared by the 4 languages. There's only one language which has one of these items, or 2 perhaps, but it really shows that the Bantu, according to the lexical impact, is a secondary layer and not a primary layer. So the Bantus were probably not around when the Creole formed. They didn't make it into the proto-language. So a few items here, just to show you that that really there are lots of similarities between these languages. So we have the word for blood, sangue, in Portuguese, sangue, isengue, sangue, thangi. So we already also see a few very outstanding features of each of these languages. The Creole of Príncipe, the language which is almost dying out, has a lot of prosthetic vowels, unlike the other Creoles. Angula, which is the language spoken on the southern portion of the island of São Tomé, has interdentals, like English, th. Okay. Thangi, and we will tha here as well. The Creole of São Tomé has many clusters with a liquid in the second position, a lateral loop. But the other Creoles often present a process of vowel lengthening to compensate for the loss of this liquid. So we have bluku, buku, buku, etc. Of course, some of the items are from 16th century Portuguese. So this word salhar, most Portuguese people do not know nowadays. I think nobody knows this word, maybe some historical linguists, but so we see that really the lexical layer related to Portuguese is related to Middle or Classic Portuguese, and of course not contemporary Portuguese. So, cognates. We also find cognates which are related to this language from the Niger Delta, Edo. So to carry a child on the back with a, bobo mina, bobo. You find it in all the Creoles. The word for louse, idu, in all the 4 languages. The word for crayfish, ize, also. Some verbs, lele, to follow or along. It's both a verb and a preposition, very typical of African languages, West African languages. And also some functional items. So, for example, an impersonal pronoun like a, which is like French on parle. Okay? So this is not a Portuguese pronoun, it's derived from a Nigerian language, and it made it into the grammar of these 4 Creole languages. And as we will see in a minute, the word for body also is used not only for body, but as a reflexive. Okay. So it's interesting to see that Nigerian lexicon is shared by all the Creoles, and that there are also functional items that are from these languages. So this kind of means that really these Nigerian language speakers were present in a very, very early stage and contributed very, very significantly to the forming proto-language, proto-Creole of the Gulf of Guinea. Bantu lexicon, on the other hand, as I said just a while ago, is typically not shared by these creoles. So São Tomé, Lunguia, Fadambo have these items which are clearly related to Portuguese: lavo, pichi, nochi, cinco, voix. So here you can see the Portuguese column. And but Angula has items which are derived from a Western Bantu language, which is Kimbundu, a language which is still spoken in Angola. And you see Nkila, Mukila, Kikie, Kikele, Thuku, Usuku, Tano, Tanu, Pukuka, Pukuluka, etc. So there is, as I said, quite some Bantu lexicon, but it's never shared by the four creoles. And this means something with respect to the origin of the proto-language. So these speakers were probably not around, and it's a secondary layer which contributed to a creole which was already crystallizing. Typology. So, of course, there are many things that can be said about these languages, but in the first place, if we look at the map of Africa and the relevant slave trade areas, so the Niger Delta and the Western Bantu areas, we have to say that all these languages belong to the largest language family of the world, which is Niger-Congo. But the Bantu languages have a very different typology from the Nigerian languages. So it's quite interesting to explore this idea that there are two slave trade areas, and the languages from these two areas maybe made a different contribution to the forming Creole. So let's see if what we just saw, the relevance of Nigeria for the lexicon, is also relevant for the typology of these Creole languages. And the first sample I would like to show you is a set of data related to the use of labial velars. I'm quite sure you're not familiar with labial velars, but these are co-articulated stops, p and b. Okay, so they're not two different sounds. They're really one sound, p, b. And these sounds these phonemes are typologically very rare. They only occur in a small part of Africa, West Africa. One of the creoles, the creole of Príncipe, the one which is becoming extinct, actually still retains labial velars. So you have Upaku, Uperi, Ikpe, Ubami, Uba, Ikbe. And it's very clear that the items in this creole are related to the items in Edo, the language from southern Nigeria. Upakon, Ikpe. So this is the tone language, and there's still a discussion going on whether these creoles are or not tone languages. But it's very clear. So when we see this, we don't have to look at Bantu languages, because Bantu languages from the areas which were relevant for São Tomé do not have labial velars. However, the other creoles lack labial velars. They have other solutions. But if we look at São Tomé, you see that it's a different item, but it's related. So Upaku is related to Kwaku. Upe is related to Kwali. Ikpe, Ukwe. So these labial velars gave rise to labialized sounds in São Tomé. Gb became bwe. And this is a Bantu solution. So what it means is that actually the Creole, the most northern Creole, Lunguia, from the island of Príncipe, is, and not only from the perspective of labial velars, is the most conservative Creole. It has the most Nigerian features. Why? Because it split off very early, and it did not receive many Bantu slaves after it split off from the main island. So it actually kind of preserved its original Nigerian nature, at least much better than the other Creoles. So on the island of São Tomé, these sounds probably also existed, so we can reconstruct these sounds. But because of the massive arrival of Bantu speakers who did not have these phonemes in their phoneme and inventory, they had to find another solution. So they learned the Creole, they acquired the Creole, but with a very Bantu-like solution, labialized sounds. Okay. So it's really, since these labial feelers are so rare typologically, it's a really strong evidence that the impact of Nigerian languages was very, very significant. So if you look at a typological map, we see that these labial feelers occur in this area, which is the Macro-Sudan area, in which languages share many typological features, and we do not find these sounds in the relevant Bantu languages. Okay. Body reflexives. So, of course, in the Romance languages you have clitics, and these creoles do not have clitics, reflexive clitics, but they have a strategy to form reflexive with the word for body. Sometimes in other languages it's a body part, like head or the heart or something like that. And what we see here is that actually the syntactic strategy, the semantics, and also the lexical item are derived from this specific language, a Nigerian language. So really, it's kind of it's calking on the Nigerian language. And this is, of course, very strong evidence for a common origin, and an origin related to Nigeria. The same goes for, so these are just a few examples, of course. The same goes for a final interrogative, which is not, well, you can call it a pronoun, interrogative pronoun, but it occurs in final position, so it's very specific, and it interrogates on nouns. So, where is the dog would be dog, where, something like that, with this item. Which is not the typical strategy in these creoles, because interrogative words are usually occur in initial position, and these ones really have to occur in final position and are very specific because they form interrogatives about noun phrases or DPs, whatever you want. And once again, as in the case of the body reflexives, we see that Edo is actually the language that contributed this item, its syntax and its semantics, to these Creole languages. So once again, we find very strong evidence that the early language from Nigeria was relevant for the formation of the Creoles, because like the body reflexives, these interrogative items are found in all four creoles, so they really spread from a common origin. And then we have a syntactic strategy, so-called serial verb constructions. I'm not sure if you're familiar with these constructions, probably not, but it consists basically of the use of two verbs to form a single event. So it's a little bit like a verb and a preposition in European languages. For example, école baquet, he run, go home. He run to the house. Okay? But ba, in this case, or we, is a verb. It's very clearly a verb. And this is a very typical in serializing language. So they use two verbs for a single event. It's a very marked syntactic feature in the languages of the world. And where do you find it? In West Africa, not in the Bantu languages. So There are many types of serial verbs constructions. These ones are directional, but you also have locative constructions with put, for example. He threw in, something like that. Okay? So it's almost always with two verbs. These languages really do not have a lot of prepositions, so they have different alternative strategies. And these strategies are found in West Africa, and in particular, once again, in this language, which was clearly relevant, crucial to the formation of the proto-language. Here you have some other examples of comitatives. For example, Inenzuta kumeloso. They gather, eat rice. But it does not mean they gathered and ate rice. It means they ate rice together. So you cannot just translate it as a coordination. It's very different. And it has different syntactic properties from regular coordinations in the language the European languages, for example. Okay? Follow leave means to leave in the company of somebody. So there's always this use of two verbs to express a single event. And this can be with many, many different verbs. It's really a core feature of these Creole languages. Okay, so where do we find it? As I said, in West Africa, not in the same large area where we find these labial velars. It's a more restricted area, but crucially, it also includes the Niger Delta languages. So it's clearly related to that area and not to the Bantu languages. The Bantu languages do not have these constructions at all. So, to sum up this part, this linguistic part, we see that a great number of lexical, phonological, and syntactic resemblances between the four languages, either directly or through reconstruction, show that they're genetically related. So there's no doubt that this is a language family. And a second conclusion is that these languages are then strongly related to the first African layer that arrived on the island of São Tomé. So far we're doing good because we saw that the homestead, that the history of these of this new settlement matches actually the linguistic feature. So there is a founder effect by this first population. And the next step I would like to look at is genetics. So will there be evidence that genetically these populations are more like Nigerian populations, or is there something else going on? As I said in the beginning, during a very large part of the history of these islands, Bantu slaves arrived on São Tomé. So what we expect, and what geneticists expected when they started sampling the population on the island of São Tomé first, was that they would be, of course, of an African type, but especially of a Bantu type. So it was really very surprising that if you look at the population of São Tomé, so this is based on a comparison of certain genetic features of these populations. I'm not going to discuss this, of course, and it's not at all my specialty, but it's very clear that the Benin, so Benin is kind of West Africa, Nigeria, Bantu, Senegal, which is of course upward, and Cameroon are very different from a genetic point of view. And if we look at the population of São Tomé, we see that the Nigerian type is actually quite substantial on the island of São Tomé. Whereas the Bantu type also has some relevance, but less than the Nigerian type. So this was very surprising for the geneticists. Well, it was especially for the linguists, because, well, for most of course. So we kind of developed an interdisciplinary study to discuss these findings and against the expectations, the genetic layout, the genetic makeup of the population of São Tomé looks really very much more Nigerian than Bantu. So it's very similar to Cuba, for example. And of course, and there's also a little bit of Senegal, and this can be explained because of contract laborers which arrived in the 19th and 20th century. So this is not related to the 16th century. It's a new genetic type which arrived much later. Okay. So this also begs for a question. Which is why are the São Tomeans more Nigerian than Bantu? And a possible answer is that the slave populations from the Congo and Angola were many times re-exported from the island. So they kind of stayed on the island for a certain while and then were re-exported to other places. They went in, they joined the transatlantic trade or something like that. Whereas the oldest population started mixing with the Portuguese and kind of stayed on the island. So that's the only explanation we can find for this genetic makeup of the population of the island of São Tomé. And then we have the Angulades. So if you remember the Angulades, Angulade is one of the 4 creoles spoken on the southern parts of the island of São Tomé. So it's spoken on the same island as the main creole, São Tomé. And there are several hypotheses, but the most relevant hypothesis for a couple of decades now is that the Angulades are runaway slaves who fled from the plantations in the 16th century. So they were kind of responsible also for the attacks on the plantation system, which drove away the Portuguese to Brazil. In this sense, we expect the Angulades to be more or less like the population, the rest of the population of São Tomé, because they used to be in the plantation system as well, but they fled from this system. However, before I go into details, in the first place we have to say that Angula is actually very much like São Tomé. So there is a very significant structural correspondence between these two languages. So there's no doubt they're both Creole languages. The only difference, the most important difference, is that Angula, as we saw, has more Bantu lexicon. It has quite a lot of Bantu lexicon, actually. And it has, in all the work, it has been claimed to be a Bantu language. But this is, of course, not true, not correct. It can be easily shown that Angula is a Creole like São Tomé and like the other 2 Creoles of the Gulf of Guinea. But it has this really substantial Bantu Kimbundu lexicon. So, when the geneticists started sampling the population, they took mouth swabs on the island, they found that there are differences between the male and the female lineages of the Angulades. And this was quite striking. So, there is a high level of differentiation in the I chromosome. So the male lineages are strongly related to Bantu areas. How do we know that? Well, for example, because there is pygmy gene flow in these populations, in these Angulade populations. But there's another striking fact. These Angulades are actually very genetically, they're very similar, the males. So it looks as though there is a kind of a clan and not a population which came randomly from the plantations. It's kind of a very close-knit group, which maybe fled from the plantations, which had the same language, and the strong feature of the male lineages is they're Bantu. They're Bantus, and they must be somehow related. So this is something of which we could not find, of course, which we cannot find through linguistics, and this opens up a very interesting hypothesis about this Creole group. The females, however, the female lineages are very diversified. So the female lineages of the Angulares are much like the rest of the population of the island. So they're very different from the male lineages. And well, we'll see in a minute what can be a possible explanation. But in the first place, if you look at the population of São Tomé and the Angulares, this is based on different haplogroup profiles, so it doesn't really matter, but on genetic differences, what we see is that São Tomé is much more complex genetically than the Angulares, right? So this is, and this is very much related to the uniformity of the male lineages of this Creole group, these Angulares. So the geneticists performed a random analysis, so they took samples from different places of São Tomé. In the southern parts, near the capital, in the plantation area. This central area is not very relevant because it's tropical forest, so there are no populations, so they're mostly on the coast. So they kind of threw all the data into the machines, and without any assumption about these populations, for example about the languages they declared when the samples were collected, what came out was that the red areas, which means that there is a genetic difference from the yellow areas, the red areas are really the areas where the Angulares live. So we don't need linguistic data. We can sample the island, and it will show us where the Angulares are, and it's perfectly correct. So you see that these are the areas where most of them live. It's a small community, but it's very clear. Why does it not extend to the south? Because here there was a plantation which mostly employed Cape Verdeans, so they're not related to Bantu at all. Near the capital of São Tomé, there is an area, it's called Pantufu Praia Milão, where there are a lot of fishermen, which is one of the traditional activities of the Angulares. And well, people from São Tomé know that most of them are Angulares. And actually, it shows up in the sample. So there's this small island near the capital where a lot of Angulares live, and it can be shown through the genetic data. So this was very, well, very exciting because it really, well, it shows that the Angulares are an example of what we call gene-language co-evolution. So they have different language, and they're also genetically different from the remaining population of the island. If we look at the female genetic differentiation, mitochondrial DNA, we see that cluster A, which is Angulares, is not very different from the remaining population of the island of São Tomé. So it's quite diversified. But if we look at the male lineages, the haplotype diversity of the Y chromosome, what we see is that the Angulares are really very concentrated. And so they're kind of this homogeneous group, maybe a clan which for some reason survived outside the plantation system and developed its own language. A Creole language, but with differences with respect to the other Creole languages. Okay. So combining the data from genes and language and of course history, which we saw as well, we can also conclude a few important things. First, that they're not a pre-European population. This is important because one of the hypotheses states that the Angulas are pre-European, but it doesn't fit the genetic data, because we would expect that if they were a pre-European population, the male and the female lineages would be more similar, okay, and different from the remaining population. So that's not the case. So it's very hard to defend, to argue that they are really different from, that they really are an older population which was already there on the island. Okay. The linguistic data, of course, clearly show that it's not a Bantu language. This was claimed until the 1970s. So people who, anthropologists, etc., would go to São Tomé and they would say that the Angulas speak a Bantu language. But of course now we know that's not true. Then there's this bottleneck event. So we have to kind of explain why they are so homogeneous. So we have to we have to call for a hypothesis where, because it were mostly the male slaves run away from the plantations. So maybe there was a kinship relation between these different males. Maybe there was an important person from a certain ethnic group who attracted other persons from this group. Something like that. We don't know. And it's of course a very complex situation, because there was not just one group outside the plantation system. The Angulas are clearly the survival of different groups who lived in the forests, in the center of the island, and then descended toward the coast. There are also lots of references to the abduction of women by the Angulares. So there were actually the Portuguese soldiers would go after the Angulares to recapture the women and everything they stole from the plantations. So there was kind of war going on, an internal conflict on the island. And the historical documented abduction of women may be the explanation for the diversification of the Angulares from a genetic point of view. So maybe this male group, which of course to reproduce needed females, attacked the plantation system, and by new mixing a more varied group arose. So it also then begs a few questions with respect to the language, the linguistic situation of the Angulares. So we still have to kind of develop research on this issue. Were they, these runaways, these Angulas, were they originally Bantu speakers who later shifted to a Creole language, for example through women? So we can imagine that if they were a Bantu speaking group which stole women from the plantations, that these women were Creole speakers. And the children who would be born in the new group, in the Angula group, would probably acquire the language of the mother. So there would be a kind of a shift from a Bantu language to a Creole, but the language, the Bantu language, the Creole, would then still retain some specific features of the male group over time. So that's one hypothesis. We can also imagine that perhaps these runaways already spoke the Creole. As I said in the beginning, Creolization was very fast on the island of São Tomé. So perhaps these males were already speakers of a Creole. And for some reason, because there were many Bantus around at a certain stage, during the plantation stage, they retained or they borrowed some features from Bantu languages, especially from the lexicon and phonology, not so much syntax. And there is another question which is also very hard to answer, because the Angulas stayed isolated from the rest of the island, according to the sources, until the 19th century. But I really doubt that is true. So probably historical language contact between the Angulares, Creole speakers, and the São Tomé Creole speakers was going on all the time. And actually, Angula supposedly is the most isolated group on the island of São Tomé, but it's in many respects much more similar to São Tomé than the other two Creole languages on the other two islands. So probably there was some contact and convergence going on between these two groups. And this really needs new research. We have to kind of we have to look at different lexical domains, for example, and see what we can find. It's not an easy task because it's, you know, if you look at the four languages, sometimes people ask which one is the most conservative of these creoles and which is the most innovative. Well, there is no definitive answer to that. The answer is that in some respects this or that creole is more innovative than the others, but it's all about specific linguistic features and not the language as a whole. Okay, so really there are many questions that still I think can be further developed and exploited, but that's really work for the future. So to conclude, what we saw is that the four Gulf of Guinea creoles descend from a single proto-language that resulted from the contact between Middle Classic Portuguese, something that also has to be developed and researched, because there are very interesting features about these creoles which show something about the history of the Portuguese language as well. So we can also look at it from the perspective of Portuguese. Today I spoke mostly about African languages, but it's also interesting to see, to look at the Portuguese dialectology, historical Portuguese dialectology, and which features from the Portuguese language, from which areas made it into the creoles and are not the result of contact with African language. So we have to exclude the African features, of course, which is not easy, but some things can be done. So it's also something interesting for future research. Okay, Portuguese, of course, and then the southern Nigerian languages, especially Ego, during the Homestead Society. So creolization, in the case of the Gulf of Guinea creoles, can clearly be seen as a very fast process. When this happens, we speak of a foundry effect, and this foundry effect applies to linguistics, genetics, and history. So these different fields come together and show the same results, and really show that there is a very, very strong foundry effect from the Niger Delta area. Because previously people thought of these creoles as being halfway between Bantu, and I should have said this in the beginning, but halfway between Bantu and Nigerian languages. But this is not true. It's clearly a two-step process. Which means that the Bantus are then the result of the Bantu layer, the lexicon, the phonology. Some of these features are clearly the result of secondary contact, but they still left an important lexical, the phonological imprint and the genetic imprint as well on these populations, and very especially on the Angulas. Okay, this paga, as you say in Creole. Thank you. God thanks.
Are there questions for Tjerk Hagemeijer? Yes? No? Oh, I heard you. Yeah.
So who speaks Portuguese?
Oh. Four. Spanish? Okay. Any other Romance languages? I guess there's some Italian in the room.
Okay, so this was a lot of new information probably.
Any African languages? Any Kimbundi?
No. Any questions? Anything I can explain a little better, or anything you would like to know? You can ask a question in Dutch as well.
No? Okay, then let's... Yes, there's a question. Okay.
Are those words on the creoles we have in there?
Not directly, but I've worked with a colleague of mine, so sometimes we do some comparative work on the Upper Guinea and the Gulf of Guinea creoles. Yes.
And do you have some conclusions on this comparison?
Sorry, where?
Some, yeah, can you just give some conclusions on this comparison?
Well, in the first, actually, in the first place, the Creoles of the Upper Guinea Creoles are much closer to Portuguese. That's very clear. They're very different. So they do not have serial verbs or labial velars. They have some features related to languages of this more the Upper Guinea, Wolof, Mandinga. So these are totally different African languages. Genetically, the Cape Verdeans are not like the Santomeans. They're like 50-50 between a European genotype and 50% African genotype. In the case of São Tomé, it's like 90-10. So it's very different. So these Creoles are much more African than the Upper Guinea Creoles. So that's one thing we can say. But they're totally different languages. Sometimes we speak about Creoles and people say, oh, okay, Creoles are more or less all the same, but they're very, very different. So if there would be a lecture on Upper Guinea Creoles, you would see that they have totally different features. But the common ground is, of course, the Portuguese lexicon. So, there is a common ground, but yeah, they're very, very, very different. And I'm not sure how much you know about them, but there are three: Cape Verdean, Guinea-Bissau Creole, and also in southern Senegal, Casamance Creole, which is very similar to Guinea-Bissau Creole. And they form another language family. So this is a new language family which descends from Portuguese, right? If we believe in the comparative method. And the Upper Guinea Creoles are another language family which is totally unrelated to this family. So the only common ground is the Portuguese lexicon.
And it's not enough to define them as belonging to the same...
As one group? No, you cannot. They're really, really very, very different. So the Creoles in India, the Portuguese Creoles in India, there's still few, they're also very different. So they have a lot of typological features from Indian languages. So Creoles are really, I know some people have argued that Creoles are very similar, that there is a kind of a prototype of Creole, but I would clearly say that's false. Because if you look at just a few Creoles, like the Upper Guinea Creoles, the Gulf of Guinea Creoles, and Portuguese Creoles in India, you see that they're so very, very different that you cannot simply say, okay, they're more or less the same because they lack morphology or something like that. It's of course not enough to say that languages are similar because they don't have morphology. So are we going to include English as well, and languages from Southeast Asia, etc. So they're very different. And actually some Creoles have morphology in Asia, India. Some of them have actually quite a bit of morphology. So there are very many differences. I think somebody else wanted to ask a question. No?
Is there any Spanish influence in Annobon?
Well, not too much. Okay, Annobon belongs to Equatorial Guinea, which has Spanish as the official language, but I would say that there are only a few borrowings, not much. But there are more borrowings from another Creole language, which is Pichi, which is an English-based Creole which is spoken on the island of Bioko, and which is kind of a lingua franca in Equatorial Guinea. And this language has quite a lot of impact on the Creole of Annobon. So Spanish, no, not so much. Not so much, but there are a few things.
Do you have highly written documentation of these Creoles?
Yes, not much.
Not much.
No, the oldest data are from the 19th century. Oldest written data, and for these four Creoles, I would say that the only Creole which has quite a bit of written documentation is the main Creole, São Tomé. But most of the data are from after the independence in 1975. So there are a few old things from the late 19th. Schuchart, for example, Hugo Schuchart. And a few people from São Tomé who had interest, wrote a little chapter with some data, proverbs and stuff like that. But there's not much. There's not much. So we really, when we reconstruct and compare, or compare and reconstruct, rather, we have to rely on the contemporary language. So we do not have any data from the 16th century, the 17th century, the 18th century. It only starts like in 1880 something. So we really, yeah. So we don't know how much these languages changed in their early years. Of course, lots of things happened in the beginning. But maybe then, you know, it's so-called punctuated equilibrium, right? So languages change suddenly, and then they go through long periods where they do not change so much. And well, the upheaval was, of course, in the beginning, and then they probably started stabilizing. So the 19th century Creole data are not very different from the contemporary data. So at least in a century or a little over a century, there are not many differences between what we find. That's the only thing I can say reliably about these languages. So, yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we've all learned a lot tonight.